It was just an ordinary gas station on the edge of a quiet Missouri town. 3 young men, all locals, clocked in for the night shift in October of 1981 and were never seen again. No bodies, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The register had been used, the lights were still on, and when police arrived the next morning, it looked like the workers had simply vanished. The case went cold. The building was boarded up, and for 4 decades, it was written off as just another unsolved mystery. But in 2021, a sealed hatch was discovered beneath the crumbling concrete, a room no one had ever entered, and something inside was still waiting. This is what they found. And to understand it, we have to go back to the night it all began. It started as just another permit job. In the summer of 2021, a demolition crew was working just outside of Darlow, Missouri, a quiet town most people pass through without remembering the name. The site was an old filling station, decommissioned since the late 90s. What remained was a crumbling concrete slab, a rusted fuel island, and an overgrown lot long since forgotten. The property had recently been purchased by a local hardware chain looking to expand their parking area. The crew's job was to clear the slab and remove any old piping. 3 days into the dig, one of the backhoes struck something solid, something that didn't show up on the blueprints. It wasn't a fuel tank. The noise of the metal bucket hitting concrete brought the foreman over. At first, they assumed it was a support block, maybe part of a wastewater system. But as they cleared away the soil, the outline of a reinforced hatch came into view. Thick steel bolts around the frame, a handle fused with rust. Nobody on the crew had ever seen anything like it. By law, they reported the finding to the town's zoning office. Within a day, the local sheriff's department cordoned off the site. The hatch was eventually opened with industrial tools, bolts cut, hinges pried. What lay beneath wasn't a utility room. It wasn't storage. It was a chamber, bare concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, burned out long ago. Inside were the remnants of uniforms, a metal stool, a clipboard with faded writing, and in the far right corner something that made every officer on site go quiet. 3 worn gas station name tags, each with a different name, each with a rusted spot behind it, where it had been pinned to something now missing. No bodies were recovered, but what the chamber suggested, what it silently screamed, was that someone had been down there. 3 someones, and they had never come back out. It was cold for early October, not enough for a coat, but enough that the guys working the night shift had zipped up their gas station jackets before coming in. The Gulf station on Route 6 had stood at the edge of Darlow since the early 60s. It was the kind of place where you could fill your tank, grab a pack of smokes, and maybe sit in your car for a minute listening to the radio. Quiet, predictable. That night, 3 employees reported for the overnight. David Rourke, 29. The shift lead. Quiet. Dependable. He'd been working the pumps for nearly 5 years. Tommy Geller, 20th college dropout, worked nights to avoid his parents. Mark Dunley, 25, former mechanic, new to the job. This was only his 3rd week. They clocked in around 10 p.m. It was the last time anyone ever saw them. By morning, the station was empty. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass. The drawer in the till was open, but all the cash was there. Coffee pot still half full. A few used paper cups in the trash. The truck parked out back, David's, was untouched. The last customer came through around 1:40 a.m. A delivery driver headed north. He said he spoke briefly with Mark, paid cash for a tank of gas, nothing unusual. The lights were still on when he pulled away, but when the morning shift arrived, just after 6 o'clock, all 3 men were gone, their coats still hanging on the rack, their paychecks from the day before left unopened on the counter. No goodbye notes, no signs of a struggle, and no idea where they went. By 8 a.m., the Darlow Police Department had been called in. An officer arrived, looked around the property, and radioed in that it was probably a walk-off. Maybe the boys had been drinking. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But the families didn't think so. David's father showed up an hour later, furious. Said his son wouldn't just disappear. Said David had a dentist appointment the next day and had just put new tires on his truck. Said David never left the register open. Tommy's mother came by too. She was already crying before she even stepped out of the car. "He's not the kind of boy who runs," she kept saying. The station owner, a man named Jack Kessler, was called in around 9:30. He unlocked the office in the back and checked the records. Nothing was missing. No money, no parts, no gas inventory unaccounted for. The only oddity he noticed was that the back storage door, normally kept bolted, was unlatched, not broken, just open. The responding officer filed the report. 3 adult males, no evidence of struggle, no reason to believe foul play. The call log showed no 911 activity overnight, and nothing had been reported in the area. The case was marked as a voluntary disappearance and turned over to the sheriff's office for follow-up. But follow-up never really came. In small towns, stories die fast when there's nothing new to tell. After the first few weeks, people stopped asking. A few rumors floated around, something about a girl in Colombia or the 3 men taking off to Texas for a construction job, but nothing concrete, nothing that held water. Eventually, the gas station changed owners. Then it shut down. Then it sat, quiet and empty. And the families were left with only questions. The official investigation didn't last long. A week after the disappearance, Deputy Glenn Mercer, who had just 3 years on the job, was assigned the case. He went through the standard motions, interviews, family statements, looked into bank activity and DMV records. Nothing came up. None of the men had withdrawn money. No bags were packed. No calls had been made from the station's payphone. There wasn't much physical evidence to work with either. No blood, no broken locks. The pump logs showed no unusual activity. The backlot was gravel and dirt. Footprints were useless after 2 nights of light rain. Deputy Mercer submitted his first report with a note that read, "No sign of foul play, but doesn't feel like a voluntary disappearance. Recommend further review." That review never happened. The following week, Mercer was pulled off the case. It was handed to a senior investigator from the sheriff's office, Detective Calvin Price. But Price only conducted 1 interview, with the gas station owner. After that, he filed a short summary concluding that the 3 men had likely chosen to leave their lives behind, and that no further action was needed unless new information surfaced. Mercer didn't agree with the conclusion. Privately, he kept some of the notes he'd written. One, found years later in a box of old case files, included a single sentence scribbled in the margin, "Feels like something under the surface here, something we weren't supposed to find." No press coverage, no missing posters after the first month, no reward. The case was archived, and for the next 4 decades no one touched it, until the hatch was found. Elliot Crane never wanted to come back to Darlow. He'd left Missouri in the late 90s and had only returned twice, once for his mother's funeral, and once to sell off the last of the family property. But when he received the voicemail from his cousin Wendy, something in her voice made him stop packing and sit down. "Elliot, I know you're not interested in this kind of thing anymore, but I thought you should hear it from me. They found something under the old Gulf station, the one where Uncle David worked. I think it's about what happened to him." Elliot listened to the message twice, then drove back the next morning. It had been 40 years since his uncle, David Rourke, had disappeared along with 2 co-workers. At the time, Elliot had been just a boy, 6 years old, too young to understand why his mom cried every night that week, why his grandfather stopped talking, why after that no one mentioned David's name again. Elliot had become a journalist in his 20s, started in crime reporting, bounced between papers, picked up freelance gigs, nothing major. Eventually, he moved into long-form investigative work, true crime podcasts, historical write-ups, the kind of quiet content older audiences liked to sink into. He'd made a living out of asking questions no one wanted to revisit. And now, one of those questions was coming home to him. He pulled into Darlow just before dusk. The town hadn't changed much. Same two-stoplight downtown. Same dusty diner off 5th Street. He parked outside his late aunt's house, David's sister's place, and was greeted with a hug and a look of concern. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's real, Elliot. The sheriff's people said there was a room down there, under the gas station. They won't say more, but one of the guys on the crew called my son-in-law. Said there were name tags down there, 3 of them. One said David. Just David." Elliot sat in silence. It felt like someone had slid a brick across his chest. That night, he unpacked his old recorder, a yellow notepad, and a camera with a cracked lens. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but he was going to find out why 3 men went missing and why his family never got an answer. It was after midnight when Elliot wandered into the attic. He hadn't meant to go up there, but the house creaked in ways he didn't remember. The kind of sounds that keep you awake when your mind's already turning over too much. So he climbed the narrow stairs, flashlight in hand, and poked through the forgotten insulation and peeling cardboard boxes. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. But then he found the crate. It was wedged behind an old bed frame, partially collapsed under its own weight. He brushed away the dust. On the lid was David's name, written in black marker, faded but still legible. Inside were papers, photographs, a Gulf uniform patch, and a worn brown envelope marked, "If anything happens to me." Elliot sat down cross-legged, the flashlight resting on his knee, and opened the envelope. There was no letter, just a cassette tape, still in its plastic case, labeled October 6th in black ink, and tucked behind the tape, a black and white photo. 3 men standing in front of the gas station pumps, smiling. David in the middle. The other 2 faces unfamiliar. On the back, in David's handwriting, "Last shift before it all changes." Elliot looked at the tape in his hands. He didn't know it yet, but what was on that cassette would change everything he thought he knew about 1981 and about what happened underground. In a town like Darlow, you didn't need a resume to get hired at the gas station. You just needed to be known. The 3 men who vanished on October 7th, 1981, weren't strangers. They were regular guys, locals, familiar faces at the diner, the hardware store, the town picnic every summer. Nothing about them screamed mystery. But the deeper Elliot looked, the more he realized they weren't all as simple as they seemed. David Rourke had been working at the Gulf station since 1976. A quiet, reliable man with a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor. He lived with his sister, Elliot's mother, after a rough breakup 2 years earlier. Friends described him as grounded, private, but fiercely loyal. He didn't drink, he didn't run with bad crowds, and he always showed up for work on time. Tommy Geller, just 20 at the time, had grown up in Darlow but spent a year at a junior college in Springfield before dropping out. Some said he came back with a chip on his shoulder. Others said he just wasn't meant for classroom life. He had a quick wit and a sharp tongue. People liked him, even if he kept folks at arm's length. His parents said he took the night shift to save up for his own car. His younger sister remembered he'd started writing a lot in a notebook that fall. No one ever found it. Mark Dunley, 25, was the newcomer. He'd moved to Darlow only 2 months prior. Rumor was he'd grown up in Ohio and had bounced around mechanic jobs since high school. The manager at the Gulf said he hired Mark because he worked hard and didn't ask stupid questions. Mark didn't talk much about his past, but the few friends he made described him as decent, soft-spoken, and maybe a little lonely. He rented a room above the old post office, paid in cash, and never missed a shift. 3 men. No criminal records, no enemies, no clear reason to vanish. What they did have in common, Elliot noticed, was proximity. All 3 were scheduled that night. All 3 were comfortable with physical labor. And all 3, at some point, had been left alone with the station's backlot and the pump system, a detail that would take on greater weight later in the investigation. Elliot jotted notes in his pad. Working class, smart, no strong motives to run. He circled one word twice. Routine. That's what made it unsettling. Because if something like this could happen to three regular guys living routine lives, what else was possible? The final interactions at the Gulf station that night came from a handful of customers, none of whom at the time had any reason to remember the visit. But Elliot tracked them down. Through old call logs, receipts, and a dusty stack of police notes left behind in the zoning office archives, he pieced together who had passed through between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. that night. The last confirmed customer was John Price, a delivery driver from Kansas City. At the time, he was making overnight hauls across Missouri for a small logistics company. Elliot found him living in a retirement community in Jefferson City. John didn't remember much, just that the station was well lit and the pumps were working. He paid for fuel with a $10 bill and spoke briefly with a younger man who seemed distracted, but polite. He looked over his shoulder a couple times, John recalled, like he was waiting on someone else to come out from the back. Elliot showed him a photo of the three workers. John pointed to Tommy. That's the guy. He was the one at the register. Another name surfaced in a different file, Georgia Lane, then 43, who had called in to ask if she'd left her purse at the station earlier that evening. She spoke with someone on the phone just after midnight. No idea who, but she remembered the voice. He was calm, said he hadn't seen a purse but would check again, sounded tired. It was the last known phone interaction from the station. After 12:10 a.m., no other outgoing or incoming calls were logged. The only real oddity came from an unsigned statement in the police file, handwritten, barely legible. It mentioned a pickup truck parked in the back lot with its lights off shortly before 2 a.m. The witness didn't stop, just drove by on Route 6 and thought it was odd someone would be back there so late. The police never followed up on the sighting. Elliot added the note to his file, a back lot, lights off, a witness. No resolution. It wasn't much, but it was more than the families ever got. And it was the first real crack in the official story. In nearly every small-town mystery, there's always that one detail that sticks out, not because it's clear, but because it never gets explained. For Darlow in 1981, that detail was the man in the leather coat. Elliot found the reference buried in a supplemental interview report, handwritten, not typed, by Deputy Mercer. Dated October 9th, 2 days after the disappearance. The witness was a 17-year-old named Calvin Drake, who had been sitting outside the all-night diner just up the road from the Gulf station. He was waiting for a friend to finish a shift in the kitchen and had walked out for a cigarette when he noticed someone across the road. Tall guy, Calvin wrote, wearing a dark leather coat, just standing by the bushes behind the station. Didn't look drunk, didn't look lost, just watching. According to the interview, Calvin saw the man twice, once around 1:15 a.m. and again closer to 1:50, walking behind the garage area toward the back of the station. Calvin said the man never looked at him, never spoke, just walked with a purpose. He assumed it was someone who worked there. Elliot followed up, wondering why this wasn't part of the main report. Turns out Calvin's statement was never filed officially. A note in the margin of the interview read, "Witness underage, not sure of accuracy, no follow-up requested." That was it. No sketch, no background check, just a shrug and a shelved piece of paper. But what stood out wasn't just the man's presence. It was the location he was seen, the back lot, the exact same area where the underground room was discovered 40 years later. Elliot circled that detail again in his notes. Whoever that man was, he wasn't lost. He wasn't loitering. He was near something. Maybe waiting for someone, or maybe watching them go in. By his third day in Darlow, Elliot had managed to secure access to the original cassette interviews from 1981, archived, boxed, and mostly ignored. Tape number 1 was labeled Jack Kessler, Station Manager, October 8, 1981. Elliot played the audio on an old recorder in the attic office. The tape hissed at first, then clicked into clarity. "State your name for the record." "Jack Kessler. I run the Gulf on Route 6. Kessler's voice was even, a little gravelly. the voice of a man who'd spent years around motors and wind chill. "Tell us what you found when you arrived at the station that morning." Everything was normal. Too normal. Register was open. Keys were where they should have been. Coffee still warm. Nobody in sight. Anything out of place? Yeah, the back storage door was unlatched. We don't leave it that way, ever. Was anything missing? Number. That's what was strange. Everything was there, except the people. There was a pause, then a quieter section of the tape. Kessler had leaned in. "Look. I probably shouldn't say this, but there's always been something weird about that property. I took over the station in '74. First winter we were here, the sump pump backed up after a freeze, flooded half the back room. When we went to clear it, we found a patch of concrete that didn't match the rest of the slab, like it had been poured later. Didn't think much of it. Now I do." The interview ended with a final note, not on tape, but written on the case label. "Follow-up interview canceled. Subject requested no further contact." Elliot leaned back. That patch of mismatched concrete? It would have been right above the trapdoor, found by the construction crew in 2021. Whatever was beneath the gas station, it had been there for decades, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. 12 days after the 3 workers vanished, the storage shed behind the gas station caught fire. It happened around 4 a.m., just before sunrise. No one saw it start, but a police cruiser on patrol noticed the smoke and alerted the fire department. By the time help arrived, the shed was fully engulfed. It wasn't much of a structure. A wood-framed utility shack with a metal roof, used mostly to store old signage and bulk cleaning chemicals. The fire didn't spread to the station itself, but the damage was complete. Nothing inside the shed was salvageable. What stood out was what wasn't there. According to a prior inspection report from the early '80s, the shed had recently been used to store several boxes of old employee files, equipment logs, and mechanical reports, items dating back over a decade. The manager had moved them there during a cleanup earlier that year. He never got around to shredding them. They were all gone now. The official report from the fire marshal listed the cause as undetermined. No evidence of arson, no accelerants found. But there were details that didn't sit right with the responding firefighters. First, the fire had burned hot and fast, too fast for a shed with so little inside. Second, the door latch had been broken before the fire, not melted in the heat, but clearly pried open. And third, no one came forward to report it, despite a neighbor mentioning they'd seen a dark-colored vehicle parked by the back fence about an hour before the flames were visible. It was never followed up. Elliot found the incident report buried in a binder labeled non-criminal property loss, not even attached to the disappearance case. But what disturbed him more was the timing. Not a day or two after the disappearance, but nearly 2 weeks later, long enough for the story to cool off, long enough for people to move on. The fire didn't feel random. It felt like cleanup. And whatever was in that shed, whatever old documents or maintenance logs might have tied the Gulf station to something underground, had gone up in smoke. On his 4th day in Darlow, Elliot visited the county record warehouse, a dusty building near the edge of town where old zoning permits, tax forms, and inspection documents went to die. He wasn't expecting much, but tucked between 2 moldy blueprints and an envelope of expired occupancy certificates, he found a small metal reel labeled simply Gulf Station, October 1981, CAM 3. It was 8mm silent film, not videotape, standard back then for motion detection cameras used in industrial buildings or security systems that hadn't yet gone digital. Elliot signed it out and took it to a former colleague in Springfield who still had a working reel-to-digital converter. They processed the footage in silence, frame by frame, eyes locked on the screen. The film was dark, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed the rear lot of the Gulf station, time stamped across the bottom corner. From midnight to just after 2 a.m., it was uneventful. A few shadows cast by the pole light, faint outlines of fuel trucks on the highway. Then, just after 1:50 a.m., movement. A figure stepped into the frame, pausing near the edge of the camera's reach. Male, broad-shouldered, dark clothing. He stood facing the back of the building, not moving, not walking, just watching. After nearly 30 seconds, he stepped out of view. A few minutes later, a second figure appeared, but not from the same direction. This one crouched low, moving near the edge of the gravel path behind the station. Then, as quickly as he arrived, he ducked into what appeared to be a shadow or recess in the ground. It wasn't immediately clear what he'd entered, but Elliot froze the frame. It looked like a gap in the earth, not quite a hole, more like an entryway, the kind you'd build a hatch over. The camera continued recording until 2:03 a.m. At 2:04, the film ended with a flicker. No exit, no return of the workers, just silence. Elliot stared at the freeze frame, that shadow, that dip in the ground. The camera that had supposedly never existed had captured what no one ever saw. The moment the ground opened up and swallowed 3 men whole. On the 5th morning of his stay in Darlow, Elliot parked across the road from the old Gulf station. It looked smaller than he remembered. The canopy over the pumps had long since collapsed, leaving behind a rusted steel frame and oil-stained concrete. Weeds pushed through every crack in the pavement. The main building had been boarded up for years. Plywood nailed across the windows, the glass underneath either broken or yellowed with time. The front door was chained shut, though the lock looked more decorative than functional. He stood outside for a while. Let the air settle. Let the sounds come back. Birds, a truck rumbling in the distance, and the low hum of power lines overhead. No cars passed in either direction for at least 5 minutes. It was dead quiet. The station had officially closed in 1998 after a second failed ownership attempt and a costly EPA inspection over fuel tank leakage. Since then, it had just sat there. No one bought it. No one tore it down. The land had been listed at auction multiple times, always pulled back due to pending zoning review. But after the recent discovery, after the construction crew accidentally struck steel, the property had been sealed again by the county. Yellow tape stretched across the west perimeter, and a posted notice from the zoning office flapped in the breeze. Elliot had made a few calls the night before, pushed some old favors, told them he was working on a historical piece. Someone at the records office agreed to grant him temporary access to the property for photographic purposes. He signed a liability waiver. That was enough. He stepped past the caution tape and walked toward the back lot. The building itself felt like a husk. It had been stripped of meaning years ago, a structure without a purpose, abandoned by memory. But behind it, past the gravel that had long turned to dirt, the real site waited. And there it was, a thick concrete slab, broken at the center where the crew had dug. The ground around it had been cleared hastily, now covered with a blue tarp and pinned down with concrete blocks. A steel hatch, modern and bolted, had been fitted over the opening. Elliot crouched beside it and ran his hand along the surface. It was cold, even in the sun. He closed his eyes and tried to picture it. David, Tommy, Mark, alive, young, standing here that night. Unaware that beneath their feet, the ground was waiting. The hatch didn't open easily. Even with the bolt undone, it took Elliot 2 hard pulls to get the lid up far enough to see inside. The hinges let out a long, metallic groan that echoed off the empty structure around him. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 or 12 feet. With an old steel ladder bolted to the wall, leading straight down into a concrete room no larger than a small office. The air that rose out was cold, dry, and tinged with dust. He lowered himself slowly, one boot at a time, until both feet landed on the hard surface below. It was quiet, still. His flashlight beam swept across the room. No furniture, no pipes or wires, just 4 concrete walls, bare except for old metal anchors along the base, maybe for shelving, maybe for something else. In the far left corner was what he came for, a small pile of objects, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. 3 items, labeled, tagged, and left behind by the crime scene team weeks earlier. Item 1, a Gulf gas station name tag. D. Rourke. Faded, slightly bent, rust around the pin. Item 2, a watch. Digital, frozen at 1:56 a.m. Item 3, a cigarette lighter, branded Show Me State, chipped and empty. But there was no blood, no clothing, no signs of human remains. Just the impression that someone, maybe 3 someones, had been down there, and they hadn't left on their own. As Elliot stood there, the flashlight beam caught something on the wall near the ladder, faint, nearly invisible under the dust. He stepped closer and wiped the surface with his sleeve. It was a mark, a number, 4, written in black marker, alone. There were only 3 missing men, so who, or what, was the 4th? The first thing Elliot noticed was how sterile the room felt. Even with the flashlight cutting a circle through the dark, the place gave off no sense of purpose. No shelving, no pipes, no drains, no furniture, just cold concrete and the distant hum of stillness pressing in from all sides. But something about the back wall caught his eye. Near the floor, partially covered by dust and time, was a cluster of scratch marks. Not random, deliberate, lines etched in stone, uneven and worn, 4 parallel tallies, and then a 5th across them. A classic count. Someone had been keeping track of something, or counting the days. He photographed the marks, then turned to the evidence bag again. The digital watch, frozen at 1:56 a.m., had likely stopped due to a drained battery, but something about that number felt off. Too precise. Elliot made a note to compare that time with the 8mm film footage. The name tag was unmistakably his uncle's, David Rourke. Even worn down, Elliot could recognize the lettering from old family photos. It was bent slightly, like it had been pulled from fabric or pressed too hard into a surface. But the most personal item was the lighter. Show Me State, it read, Missouri's nickname, chipped, faded, and blackened near the hinge. Elliot remembered it. He'd seen David flick it open one summer, sitting on the porch, lighting fireworks with a grin. It was the only thing from that room that felt human, and yet something still didn't sit right. If this space was used for storage, why no dust on the floor? Why the scratch marks? Why the number 4 written near the ladder when only 3 men disappeared? Elliot stood in silence, letting the questions build. Then he climbed back out of the chamber, locked the hatch behind him, and drove straight to the only place that might still have working audio equipment capable of playing a cassette from 1981. He was done guessing. The cassette was old, warped slightly, the label nearly worn off. October 6th, it read, the day before the disappearance. Elliot fed it into the deck at a community college audio lab in Springfield. A friend had let him in after hours. The room was quiet, save for the soft whir of the tape machine engaging. He pressed play. For a moment, nothing. Then static. And then a voice. Test. Okay. This should be rolling now. Dave, if you find this, don't tell Jack, all right? Just listen. The voice was young, nervous, a little breathless. It was Tommy Geller. We were checking the storage drain last night after the rain, the one behind the back lot. Mark thinks there's a crawl space under it, but it's sealed. We found some old hinges, maybe a panel, but the concrete's weird. Looks newer than the rest, like it was patched over. Anyway, we're going to take another look tonight. The tape crackled. If I'm wrong, fine. I'll owe you a beer. But if I'm not, if there's something down there, I just want it on record that I said something. A pause, shuffling in the background. Then, softer. Mark's been jumpy all day. Keeps saying he heard a hum like a generator. But there's nothing back there. Nothing we can see anyway. The tape hissed again. Another pause. Then the final words, just before the recording ended. If we're not back by sunrise, maybe check under the slab. Click. Elliot sat frozen. The room around him felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. That tape hadn't been a prank. It hadn't been paranoid rambling. It was a warning, one that no one had ever heard until now. And the question hanging in the silence was clear. What did they find beneath the slab? The name had come up twice now. Deputy Glenn Mercer, the young officer who took the original missing persons report back in 1981 and had quietly questioned the official story. His handwriting was all over the early case files. His notes were more detailed than most, and most notably, he was the one who wrote, "Feels like something under the surface here, something we weren't supposed to find." At the time of the disappearance, Mercer was only 26. Now in his 60s, he'd retired from law enforcement more than a decade ago and had since moved to a small property just outside Osceola, about 2 hours south of Darlow. Elliot made the drive with no guarantee of cooperation. He knew how these visits usually went. Either the person welcomed the chance to talk, or they shut the door the second a tape recorder came out. Mercer was somewhere in between. He answered the door with a slight limp and a cautious expression, leaning heavily on the frame. His hair had thinned out, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who claimed to have let go of the past. Elliot introduced himself, mentioned his uncle, David Rourke, said he was working on a piece about the disappearance and hoped Mercer could spare a few minutes. The retired deputy didn't speak at first. He just looked at Elliot, really looked at him. Then, with a dry voice, he said, "I was wondering when someone in that family would come knocking. They sat on the back porch, no recorder, just notes." Mercer didn't talk about ghosts or conspiracies. He didn't spin any wild theories. What he did talk about was procedure, the kind that got ignored in small towns when things got uncomfortable. From day one, that case smelled off, he said. 3 grown men vanish, no sign of a fight, nothing stolen, no one talks. Then they shut me down after 2 weeks. Told me to stop asking questions. Told me no foul play. But I saw those reports. I saw the property map. Elliot asked about the hatch, about the concrete slab. Mercer nodded slowly. That slab? Wasn't in the original building plans. I tried to flag it, asked the owner about it. He clammed up. Then, a week later, the shed burns. All those files? Gone. He looked away for a moment, then added, "I think someone built something under that place a long time ago. And when those boys got too close to finding it, someone made sure they didn't talk." Elliot leaned forward. "You think it was murder?" Mercer shook his head. "Number, I think it was something worse." Elliot left Osceola with 2 things, a worn legal pad of names and dates Mercer had kept in a filing cabinet since 1981, and a single sentence that wouldn't leave his mind. "I think it was something worse." Back in Darlow, he took the list to the local planning office. It was modest. 1 front desk, a few metal cabinets, and a clerk who looked like she hadn't had a visitor in hours. Elliot asked about construction permits, especially anything involving the Gulf Station between 1975 and 1981. The clerk searched the computer, then frowned. "That station's file is light," she said, "like too light." Elliot asked for physical records. After a long dig, she came back with a single dusty folder. Inside were the basics. Ownership deeds, a fuel tank compliance certificate from 1978, and a rough diagram of the building footprint. Nothing about the slab, nothing about underground work, no contractor names, no blueprints. But at the bottom of the folder was a half-torn invoice. It was faint but readable. September 1979, cement delivery, reinforced grade. Location, rear lot. Work order 781-restrict. No business name, no signature, just a phone number. Elliot called it that night. The line was disconnected, but a reverse directory search led him to a construction firm that no longer existed. Thompson and Ellis Contracting, dissolved in 1985 after one of its partners was convicted of illegal waste dumping in rural Missouri. There were no other records, no one to call, no one to ask. It was like the company and the work it had done had been wiped off the books. Elliot stared at the invoice again. That work order, 781-restrict, restrict. It wasn't just a job code. It felt like a warning. Like even back then, whoever ordered that work knew it needed to stay buried. Her name was Georgia Lane, a retired school bus driver who'd lived in Darlow her entire life. Elliot had found her name earlier in the police file. She was the woman who'd called the station around midnight on October 7th, 1981, asking if she'd left her purse there. It was a brief call, no red flags at the time. But Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that she'd heard more than she realized. He drove to her home just outside of town, a modest single-story place with a sloping porch and wind chimes that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. Georgia answered the door with a walker and a sharp eye. She invited him in after hearing David's name. "I knew David, knew his sister too," she said. "Sweet boys, all three of them. Gone just like that." They sat in the kitchen. Elliot explained what he'd found: the hatch, the cassette, the photos. Georgia didn't seem surprised, but when he mentioned the phone call, her expression changed. "I never told the cops everything," she said quietly. "Didn't want to seem crazy." She sipped her tea, then leaned in. "When I called, a man answered. Not a kid. Deep voice. Didn't say his name. I asked about my purse, and he said, 'We haven't seen anything, ma'am, but I'll keep an eye out.' Very polite, but distant. Then I heard something in the background, a banging noise, like metal on metal. Then a voice, not close to the phone, farther off, sounded scared. It said, 'Don't,' and then the line clicked. Elliot's pen froze. You're sure it wasn't static? Georgia shook her head. No, honey. It was a man's voice. Real, frantic, like he was about to say something important, and then it cut out like someone hung up for him. She paused again, then added, I waited for a call back. Never got one. I told the police I heard noise, but not about the voice. Figured it wouldn't matter. But it did, because it meant that at least one of the men, possibly all three, had still been alive, possibly restrained, while the station was open and functioning. They didn't vanish into thin air. They were still there underneath, as the register stayed open and the light stayed on. Someone else was upstairs, answering the phone. That night, Elliot returned to his aunt's house and started re-examining the old photos he'd brought from the attic box. He'd gone through them before, shots of David with friends, behind the register, smoking out back. But one photo hadn't caught his attention until now. It was taken just outside the station. 3 men in Gulf uniforms stood beside the pump island, arms crossed, relaxed. It was dated October 5th, 1981, 2 days before they vanished. David stood in the middle, Tommy on the left, Mark on the right. Behind them, the garage door was open, revealing a shadowy glimpse of the station's back wall. Elliot zoomed in. At first, it looked like nothing, just the dark interior of a maintenance bay. But near the bottom corner of the photo, almost hidden by glare, was a rectangle, a cut into the concrete floor, clean edges, a shape too exact to be natural. He enhanced the photo on his laptop. The glare faded just enough to show what looked like a metal latch. Not big, but there. And next to it, a foot. Not one of the workers. The others were wearing oil-stained sneakers. This was a black dress shoe, polished, pointed, barely visible in the frame. Someone had been standing just inside the garage during the photo, watching them. Elliot flipped the photo over. There was no caption this time, just the date. October 5th, 1981. But now he knew 2 things for sure. 1. The hatch wasn't just some mystery found in 2021. It had been there the whole time, visible even, if you knew where to look. 2. And someone else was there when that photo was taken. Someone who didn't belong. Someone who stayed in the shadows. Elliot stared at the shoe, not a mechanic's, not a worker's. It was the kind of shoe a man wears when he wants no one to know he was ever there. It was almost an afterthought. While rechecking the attic box back at his aunt's house, Elliot opened a folded receipt tucked between 2 old pay stubs. It was dated October 2nd, 1981, from Anderson Supply, a hardware store in Darlow that had closed in the late 90s. The receipt showed 3 items purchased in cash: 1 flashlight, 1 can of WD-41, hatch hook, and hinge kit. That alone would have been suspicious, considering the hidden door found under the station. But what caught Elliot's attention wasn't the items, it was what was written on the back. The handwriting was David's, sharp, fast, done in black ballpoint, but the words didn't make immediate sense. 4 turns left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 inches, 4 down. Numbers lie, names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. Elliot stared at the strange message. Was it a riddle? A code? Instructions? The phrase, numbers lie, names don't, echoed in his mind. He thought about the 4 written on the wall in the sealed room, about the tally marks scratched into the concrete, about the name tag, D. Rourke, left behind like a signature. Was David trying to leave a path? He took the receipt to a friend, a retired cryptographer who'd worked with code-breaking patterns during the Cold War. After an hour of study, the man leaned back and said, "This isn't a code in the traditional sense. It's a set of physical directions, a sequence, left turns, tapping, pushing, probably instructions to access something mechanical. 12 in, 4 down, maybe inches, a wall panel, a door?" He circled the last line. That part. If it's not shut, don't go in. That's a warning. Whatever he found, he didn't trust it. Elliot photographed the note and added it to his file. He didn't yet know what 12 in, 4 down would open, but he was starting to realize. The gas station wasn't the secret. It was just the lid. By now, Elliot was running out of time. He'd already overstayed the grace he'd gotten from the county officials who let him access the property. If he was going to uncover what lay beneath that concrete slab, it had to happen soon. So he turned to the only place no one had bothered to check in 40 years, the Darlow Water Board archives. Back in 1980, much of rural Missouri had operated with outdated sewer systems, some of them hand-dug and maintained by private contractors. Larger structures, like gas stations, were often built on top of older utilities, especially in small towns where land reuse was common. With help from a retired utility worker named Dennis Pike, Elliot dug up a basement roll of blueprints, water flow, and storm drain layouts from 1952. And what they found stopped them both cold. Running directly beneath the current site of the Gulf Station was a pre-existing tunnel labeled Secondary Storm Access, closed 1964, unsealed. The line showed a horizontal shaft approximately 5 feet wide, sloping downward toward the edge of the property. It was connected to 2 vertical vents, both marked sealed, but no date or record of when they were shut. And there, just east of the gas station's main building, was a faint red circle drawn in pencil, not part of the original print, added later. Faded. Next to it, the letters DONOTDIG. Dennis stared at it for a long time. "That's not a utility mark," he said. "That's a warning from someone after the fact." "That red pencil? That's contractor code. Someone found something they weren't supposed to and marked it quietly." Elliot traced the path from the storm tunnel to the sealed room found beneath the slab. It lined up almost exactly, but if that shaft had been built in the 50s, closed in the 60s, it meant that whatever was under the Gulf Station predated the station itself, and someone knew it, and chose to build over it anyway. It was just after 2 a.m. when Elliot returned to the site. He waited for the cover of night, not because he was doing anything illegal, but because what he was about to do shouldn't be watched. He brought only what he needed: flashlight, gloves, the cassette recorder, and a copy of David's note. 4 turns left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 inches, 4 down. He climbed down into the sealed chamber once more, the one under the steel hatch installed by the construction team. This time, he wasn't there to inspect evidence. He was there to follow instructions. Starting at the ladder, Elliot looked toward the back wall. That's where the dust was lightest, where the scratch marks had been, And that's where he found it, a recessed panel in the concrete wall, just slightly out of alignment. He stood in front of the flashlight mounted on the ceiling beam, the only piece of modern gear down there. It wasn't part of the original space, but the light referenced in David's note wasn't literal. It was likely a starting point. He rotated to his left. 4 full steps. Facing the wall, he crouched. He tapped the surface gently, once, twice. The sound was dull, solid. Then he pushed. Nothing. But when he dropped to his knees and measured, 12 inches in from the corner, 4 inches down, he saw it, a tiny rusted handle, built flush into the concrete, covered in grime, nearly invisible. He pulled. At first, nothing moved. Then came a sharp metallic click, so sudden it made him flinch. The panel shifted slightly more and opened. Behind it, a vent-sized crawl space descending at a steep angle. The air that escaped was stale and dry, but not moldy. No animal smell, no rot. It was empty air, preserved. Elliot crawled in, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The narrow tunnel bent once, then again. He could feel the slope gradually increasing, leading him beneath the chamber he'd just been in. He was no longer in the gas station. He was underneath it. And what he found next would change everything. The crawl space opened into a larger void. Not quite a room, not quite a tunnel. It felt carved, not built. Concrete faded into raw earth and stone. The flashlight beam cut through dust so thick it looked like fog. He took a step inside, then another. The floor was hard-packed dirt, and the air had a low resonance, like the whole space was breathing. Elliot paused. The walls bore marks, not symbols, not words, just scratches, hundreds of them, all along the perimeter, horizontal, frantic, made with something metallic, judging by the occasional glint. He saw a rusted pry bar in one corner, its edge bent and dulled. Someone had tried to dig out. But this wasn't the sealed room he'd visited earlier. This one was older, deeper, and much more hidden. Against the far wall, he saw a wooden structure, half collapsed like a makeshift bunk or pallet. Next to it sat a metal crate, partially buried, and a glass bottle, shattered long ago. But what drew him in was the center of the room, a circular patch of earth, perfectly smooth, unnaturally dark, as if the soil had been scorched or tampered with, no tool marks, no footprints, just void. Elliot knelt by it and shined his light. That's when he noticed something embedded in the dirt, a small ID badge, cracked, weathered, and still clipped to a rusted chain. He pulled it loose. Mark Dunley. It was real. The missing men had been here, not just in the upper room, not just near the hatch, here, buried under it all. He didn't say anything aloud. There was no one to hear it, but he knew what this meant. The sealed room upstairs? It was a holding space. This was where they were taken. And the real question now wasn't just who brought them here. It was, how long had this place existed, and who built it? Elliot left the chamber just after sunrise. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, he just drove. Straight to the county library, where the archives still held paper records dating back to the early 20th century. Not the digitized summaries, the real records. Yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten code enforcement reports, even microfilm reels of local coverage from a time when Darlow was barely more than a speck on the map. His goal was clear now: find out if anything like this had happened before. And then he found it, tucked inside a box marked Miscellaneous Civil Incidents, a typewritten statement dated July 12, 1953, from a rail maintenance worker named Frank Behrens. The report had been filed to the city after Frank was nearly injured during a routine utility inspection near the west edge of town. He described falling nearly 6 feet into an unmarked pit, partially concealed under brush and discarded lumber. Inside, he said, was a stone-walled chamber, empty but too precise to be natural. The county surveyor investigated and dismissed the hole as a collapsed foundation from an old smokehouse. But Behrens wasn't satisfied. A week later, he submitted a follow-up note, hand-scrawled at the bottom of the form. Too deep for a smokehouse. Walls were smooth. Looked like someone made it for keeping things in, or keeping things out. The site was quietly filled in later that month. No investigation, no photos. And that was it. Elliot leaned back in the chair. It had been almost 3 decades between that incident and the gas station disappearances. And yet the details, sealed spaces, smooth walls, and total silence afterward, were disturbingly familiar. He mapped the old rail site and overlaid it with the modern layout of Darlow. The 1953 chamber was roughly half a mile from the Gulf Station. A straight line between them would pass through 3 residential lots, a wooded stretch of land, and, most interestingly, the old grain co-op building shut down since 1971 due to structural instability. 3 sealed locations, 3 decades apart, same underground patterns. Whatever had been under the gas station in 1981, it didn't start there. Still in the archives, Elliot pulled local school records from the same period. Not because he expected answers, but because Mercer had once mentioned something odd during their porch conversation. The week those men vanished, the high school ran a fire drill in the middle of the night. No one talked about it. They just did it. That detail had never made sense, until now. And sure enough, buried in the records for October 1981, there it was. A scheduled after-hours emergency evacuation drill conducted on October 6th, the night before the gas station workers vanished, held at 1:30 a.m. There was no explanation for why a drill would happen at that time. No weather warnings, no electrical tests, no precedent, just a list of students and staff who reported for it, all marked as present. And curiously, one student had been excused early, minutes before the drill began. Timothy Kessler. Elliot blinked. Kessler. Same last name as Jack Kessler, the station manager in 1981. The one who gave the taped interview and later refused to speak again. Elliot pulled the student record. Timothy Kessler, age 17, Jack's son. The file showed no disciplinary record, good grades. A part-time job listed, Gulf Station, Route 6, same location. According to the record, Timothy left early due to a family matter. No further details. So the night before the disappearance, the manager's son, who worked at the gas station, left a late-night school drill early. The gas station crew was making plans to open the hatch behind the lot. And less than 24 hours later, all 3 men were gone. Elliot sat still for a long time, trying to quiet the theory forming in his mind. It couldn't be. But it made too much sense. What if the fire drill wasn't about evacuation? What if it was about diversion? It was late afternoon when Elliot found himself parked outside the Kessler residence. The house sat at the edge of town, a modest single-story ranch with beige siding and a flat lawn that looked too perfectly trimmed to be natural. A wind spinner turned lazily in the breeze. No cars in the driveway, but a porch light was on, even though the sun was still up. Jack Kessler, the former station manager, had long since stopped giving interviews. After the disappearances in 1981, he remained in Darlow for only a few years before leaving quietly and retiring early. Rumor was he suffered a stroke in the mid-2000s and hadn't spoken publicly in decades. But Elliot wasn't here to see Jack. He was here for Timothy. Now in his early 60s, Timothy Kessler had returned to Darlow just a few years ago to care for his aging father. He still lived in the house, still drove the same faded blue pickup from the 90s, and, according to the town clerk, had been one of the first people at the gas station site the morning the underground room was discovered. Elliot knocked. The man who answered was quiet, lean, and slower than he probably used to be. His hair had thinned and his face was weathered, not just from age, but from burden. They stood in silence for a beat before Elliot spoke. "I'm David Rourke's nephew." The name hit like a stone. Timothy's mouth twitched slightly, then settled. He didn't invite Elliot in, But he didn't close the door either. "You're digging up something that never should have been uncovered," he said flatly. "There's a reason the station was buried, a reason people moved on." "3 men didn't move on," Elliot replied. "And someone needs to tell me why." Timothy's eyes darkened. "Because they went where they shouldn't have, and my father tried to keep it sealed." Elliot felt a chill form behind his ribs. Did he know about the chamber? "He didn't build it," Timothy said, "but he knew it was there, just like the others did." "You think you're the first one who's tried to open that hatch?" "You're not. They tried before, in 71, in 64. It never ends well." "So what happened that night? A long pause? Then he gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it." And with that, Timothy closed the door. Elliot stood there for a full minute before stepping away. He knew now that the Kesslers had known about the room all along, maybe not what was inside, but enough to stay away. And in trying to warn the others, they may have chosen silence over guilt. The envelope arrived at his aunt's house that evening. No return address, no postmark, just his name, Elliot Crane, written in thin black pen across the front in all capital letters. Inside was a single photocopy of a police memo stamped confidential and dated October 20th, 1981, 13 days after the disappearance. The subject line read, "Internal Review of Gulf Station Case, Field Summary, from Lieutenant Monroe." The report was short, 2 paragraphs, but it changed everything. On October 17th, the third inspection of the Gulf Station site yielded no new evidence. The original entry chamber had been confirmed, but no further search was conducted beyond ground level. Concerns raised by Deputy Mercer regarding subterranean layout were dismissed. Recommendation: full closure of the investigation, pending reclassification as unexplained disappearance. But it was the second paragraph that chilled Elliot to the bone. Request from Kessler, MGR, to delay demolition of rear lot denied. Alternate solution proposed by code enforcement. Seal existing chamber with reinforced concrete, no press release, and permanent transfer of deed to Darlow County. Internal note suggests this was the preferred method to discourage urban exploration and future liability. There it was, proof of deliberate burial. They'd known. They hadn't just found the chamber in 1981, they'd debated how to handle it. And instead of digging deeper, instead of pursuing what might have happened to the 3 men, they poured concrete over it and walked away, buried it, literally. Not because there was nothing down there, but because there was something, and they didn't want anyone else to find it. Elliot held the envelope in his hands, staring down at the stamp across the top of the memo. "Do not copy, internal only." Someone had copied it, and someone wanted him to keep digging. The memo had confirmed what Elliot already suspected. They had sealed the chamber not out of ignorance, but out of fear, and more importantly, they had chosen not to look deeper. But now Elliot couldn't stop himself. He returned to the property records once more, specifically the old building schematics and utility overlays from before the gas station was constructed in 1970. And there it was, hidden in the margins of a surveyor's blueprint. A disconnected segment of the storm tunnel system, no entrance, no exit, just a blank rectangular void labeled Cavity DNR2, with a handwritten note below, no access, no record of purpose. Elliot had missed it before. Everyone had. But now that he knew what to look for, it was clear. The sealed chamber wasn't the hidden room. It was one of them, and just east of the original slab, 20 feet underground, was a second structure that had never been mapped to surface level. No crawl space, no hatch, no way in, not unless you knew where to look. That night, he returned to the site again, this time with a single goal: find the entry point to DNR2. It took him nearly 4 hours. He probed the backlot, paced out every measurement, rechecked the blueprints. Then, finally, behind the rusted support post of the old station's collapsed pump canopy, he heard it, a hollow echo beneath his boot. He scraped back the dirt, revealing a rust-colored steel plate. fused to the ground, no visible hinges. There was no handle, no screws, just a seam. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 40 years. And beneath it, if the survey was right, was something no one had seen since the night David, Tommy, and Mark vanished. It took tools, time, and more strength than Elliot thought he had, but by just after 3 a.m., he'd pried the panel free. The air that escaped was dry, but not stale. It had weight, like it had been waiting to exhale. A ladder descended into darkness. This was no concrete crawl space, no rough-hewn tunnel. The walls were smooth, engineered, and lined with thin metal ribs. Not military, not commercial. Custom. Elliot dropped down. The lower chamber was colder than the others, and quieter. No hum of surface power, no ambient drip of condensation, just silence, deep and complete. He swept the flashlight around. It was larger than the previous room, nearly 20 feet wide, 10 feet high. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed. But on the far side, against the steel wall, was something unmistakable. A chair, bolted to the floor, restraint cuffs hanging off both arms, a spotlight above. It wasn't police. It wasn't medical. It was containment. Beside the chair was a narrow metal table. On it lay a notebook, its pages fused from time and moisture, but one was still legible, and on it was scrawled in block letters, "Do not speak to IT. Do not answer. If it remembers your name, leave immediately." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at the chair, the spotlight, the chains. This wasn't a place to keep people. It was a place to hold something else. Something that could listen. Something that could speak. And just then his flashlight dimmed slightly, not out. Just flickering. A pulse. He checked the batteries. Fresh. The beam steadied. But as he turned back toward the entrance, the light caught something he hadn't seen before. On the wall, behind the chair, etched into the metal, were 3 letters, Dr. David Rourke, and beneath it, scratched faintly, almost like an afterthought, "We weren't alone." Elliot spent the next day in a daze. The chair, the restraints, the message on the wall, all of it pointed to something far worse than an unsolved disappearance. This wasn't just neglect. It wasn't a cover-up to protect a reputation or dodge liability. It was deliberate containment. And someone, maybe the men who sealed the room, had known exactly what they were locking down there. But what had the gas station crew found? Why had they entered that space at all? Elliot went back to the attic box once again. Notebooks, receipts, photographs. And that same old cassette, the one Tommy recorded before the disappearance. He'd already played it once, but now, with fresh eyes, he noticed something strange. The tape side B had never been played. He had assumed it was blank, a leftover from when cassettes flipped automatically. But now every detail mattered. He brought the tape back to the community college lab that night and slid it into the deck. Side B whirred to life. Static, then movement. Not speech, just footsteps. 3 pairs by the sound of it. Muffled, echoing. A voice came through. It was Tommy again. "Okay, we're at the hatch. Mark's gonna pop it. David's got the flashlight." Then a clang of metal. The sound of a latch opening, followed by a heavy scrape. More footsteps. Then silence. Elliot leaned in, volume up. Another voice, distant. "David, there's something carved into the wall. I can't make it out. Looks fresh." Tommy. "This place is bigger than it looks. The floor is different, smoother. Concrete maybe." "Hold on." "Mark, what is that?" A pause. Something scraping, then breathing. Tight, uneasy. Then Mark's voice, low and shaken. "It's not empty." The audio warbled for a moment. A strange, rhythmic clicking in the background. "Tommy, shut up, shut up. Do you hear that?" "David, I think it's coming from the other side of the wall." Then a voice, but not theirs. Something soft, mechanical, yet human enough to feel wrong. A whisper, not captured clearly, but Elliot could make out a phrase repeated twice. "Did you come back for me?" A sudden crash, shouts, movement, panic, then static, and the tape ends. Elliot sat in the dark lab playing the tape again, and again. Every time he reached the whispered phrase, it hit the same way, like an ice pick behind the ribs. "Did you come back for me?" Not a scream, not a threat, a question. That was what haunted him most. If the voice had been violent, angry, monstrous, it would have made sense. But this sounded aware, intelligent, and lonely. He pulled out the notebook again, the one he'd found near the containment chair. Though most of the pages were ruined, he'd managed to pry a few open, and one of them, dated October 5th, included a chilling observation. It responds to memory triggers, names, places, smells. Once it starts speaking, you must not engage. Acknowledgement accelerates cognition. Another page with shakier handwriting. It mimics the voices of people it hears. It doesn't understand death. It keeps asking about the others. It thinks they're still here. The pieces began to fall into place. David, Tommy, Mark. They hadn't just stumbled onto a sealed room. They had woken something up, something left behind, or buried, for reasons long forgotten, something with a voice. And when they answered back, even once, it learned. Elliot closed the notebook and whispered out loud, as if to hear how it felt in the air. We weren't alone. He believed it now, not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. Something else had been down there that night, and someone had gone to incredible lengths to make sure no one ever found it again. Elliot didn't sleep that night. The notebook, the chair, the voice on the tape. It all formed a picture he hadn't been prepared for. He hadn't uncovered a conspiracy or a cover-up for profit or shame. He'd uncovered a decision, one made 40 years ago when 3 men went missing, and someone chose silence over exposure. A choice that people in town had lived with ever since. He met with retired Deputy Mercer one last time, told him about the second chamber, played him the audio. Mercer sat still the entire time, then quietly reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out a faded envelope. Inside was a photograph, a grainy black and white image, clearly old. It showed the foundation pit during construction of the gas station in 1970, workers in hard hats, rebar rising from the dirt. But at the bottom of the image, barely visible, was a hatch, already there, set into the earth, long before any concrete was poured. "I tried to show this to the captain back then," Mercer said. "He said it was a trick of the light, that I needed a break." Elliot stared at the hatch. It was the same size, same shape. They hadn't just built on top of it by accident. They'd chosen it. That night, back at the motel, Elliot laid everything out on the table. Photos, reports, the cassette, the coded note, and the survey map showing DNR2. Then he picked up his recorder and asked himself the same question 3 times. What happens if I release this? What happens if I don't? What would David have done? And somewhere in the silence between those questions, he realized the truth. There was no answer that felt right. Only consequences. Elliot left Darlow the next morning. He didn't tell his aunt goodbye, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want her involved any further. He left the box of evidence with Deputy Mercer, along with copies of everything. The photos, the tape, the blueprints, even the audio from Side B. He made 2 additional copies. One he mailed to a journalist friend in Chicago, with a note that read, "If I don't reach out in 30 days, publish everything, as is," and the third he kept with him. 2 weeks later, he recorded his final log entry from a roadside motel near the Arkansas border. October 18th, 2021. I've gone as far as I can. The tape is real. The chambers are real. And whatever they found down there, it's still sealed. I don't know if it's alive. I don't even know if it was ever technically human. But it remembered David's name. And that means it remembers others. If you're hearing this, don't go looking. Don't dig it up. Don't try to prove me right. Because some truths don't want to be uncovered. Some are just waiting. The recording ends there. No signature, No follow-up. Just the hum of room silence and the faintest sound in the background, a whisper, too low to make out clearly. But if you listen closely, and it almost sounds like it says, "Did you come back for me?" 40 years ago, 3 men vanished without a trace. And what they may have uncovered beneath that gas station was never meant to be found. The evidence was buried, the chamber was sealed, and the few who knew the truth chose silence over answers. But now, the cracks have started to show. If what they heard down there was real, if something was speaking, then we have to ask, how many others knew? How many rooms like this are still hidden? And more importantly, what happens if someone decides to open one again? Because some things don't stay buried. They wait.